over the party to make it his party. I mean, there have been a number of people not as well known as yourself. And I'm thinking about somebody like, the conservative Wisconsin talk radio host, Charlie Sykes, who was one of the first after the 2016 election to come out and say, part of this is my fault because I ignored the fringe elements. I ignored the racism. I thought it was not important. I didn't think it was a big deal. And I'm part of the problem here. What part of this do you own? And how do you understand the fact that Donald Trump has gotten to where he has?
Look, I always considered myself a jack. I fought in the party to outreach to gay Americans, to Black Americans, to Hispanic Americans. No one's going to find examples of racial demagoguery in my career. I'm the guy who wouldn't allow the McCain campaign to run Jeremiah Wright ads because they were racially toxic. The Republican Party became the party of Fox News. It became an entertainment party. It became a reality show. Right? Year by year, the freaks rose. The number of people who were out there as entertainers, not policy leaders. Policy was stripped away from the party until it became a husk. Really what it is an organized conspiracy to maintain power for political self-interest. And that's evidenced by the platform. What the platform became in its final form in 2020 was essentially an oath of obedience and loyalty to Donald Trump, the shed of any ideas, any notion that the party stood for actual issues, ideas, public policies for the public good. And that's a tragedy in a country that has a two-party system. What we have now, right, this has become through omission or commission, and there's more than enough commission in it, and a hell of a lot of omission. It has become America's first autocratic party. Now, what I would also say this to my progressive friends, should think carefully about the condescension, about the elitism, about the indifference that a lot of people hear in this country from those messages. We have 40% of this country doesn't have $400 cash available. That is destabilizing our democracy. FDR, there's a lot of analysts who will look back and say, well, his New Deal program didn't particularly work economically. And they're probably right in the analysis. But they work politically, and not from a vote share, but in a macro sense. Because they sustained faith and belief in democracy in the eyes of the people at a moment where all over the world in the 1930s, fascism, extremism, and nationalism was rising as the antidote to economic depression. Faith, hope, and belief. Right? And we're going to be a pro-democracy organization, both here domestically and globally, right? Fighting in this era of autocracy and democratic rescission.
So what's your goal now?
We will oppose Trumpism. We have a view of Trumpism. It is a rooted ideology, an autocratic ideology with fascistic markers that's comprised by an amalgam of extremist groups, conspiracy theorist groups, militia groups, white nationalist groups, proto-fascist groups like the Proud Boys. We've seen dozens and dozens and dozens of members of Congress and U.S. senators refuse to acknowledge reality and acknowledge the results of a legitimate election, poisoning American democracy. And so we're going to fight for American democracy as part of a coalition in defense of it.
How do you get people to care about that?
There's only two ways to win a fight. You can bring your opponent to submission, or your opponent can bring you to exhaustion. Submission, think Germany and Japan in 1945. Exhaustion, think of the United States and Vietnam in 1975. We cannot become exhausted in this fight, or we will lose the country and American democracy. We have to bring the forces that Trump has referenced listen, what I would say to Congresswoman AOC is we have to bury this together, all of us. The militia groups, the people who store up the militia, the Michigan Capitol, right? The sentiment that it's okay to arrest and kidnap governors and fry them in basements. The idea on Fox News that a kid who picked up his AR-15 and shot 3 people in Wisconsin looking for trouble is some sort of national hero. We need the forces that Trump has whipped up to recede, to shrink. And we have to beat them at the ballot box, or we will lose the country. Trumpism wasn't repudiated in one election. We've had America's greatest con man in history, one of its greatest demagogues in history, assume the power of the presidency, and he vandalized the country politically. It's polity. He worked for self-interest. He poisoned the public good. He's a consequential president. It will take us a long time to recover from this, both in spirit, physically, and from our animosity that he has spoken.
Steve Schmidt, thank you so much for talking with us today, and I do hope we'll talk again.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Republican Party's complicity when it comes to Trump's spread of misinformation and his concerted effort to stoke distrust in an election deemed the most secure in our country's history, and which Attorney General Bill Barr said was free from widespread fraud, could do lasting harm. That's the view of former Republican Senator Jeff Flake, who tweeted this about Trump's pressuring of local officials to overturn the will of the people. Quote, "There is long-term damage when this kind of behavior is normalized. It is not normal, and elected Republicans need to speak out against it. Something only a handful of them have done. As of today, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Republican senators have explicitly acknowledged that Joe Biden is the next president, which means that only 1 has come out in the 16 days since we told you, are shocked that only 5 had spoken out. Nearly 90% of elected Republican senators are still staying quiet or dancing around the fact that we will have a new occupant in the Oval Office on January 20th. That refusal to acknowledge, even more striking given yesterday's devastating blow from the United States Supreme Court, which refused to take up an appeal that tried to nullify the certification of Pennsylvania's election results. It was described this way by Peter Baker of the New York Times, quote, "The Supreme Court, with 3 justices appointed by Trump, thought so little of his allies' bid to overturn the election results in Pennsylvania that it dismissed the case with just 1 sentence and no noted dissents. Even in the face of that blatant dismissal, Donald Trump continues to falsely claim that the election was stolen from him. Today, he tweeted a flurry of falsehoods, many of which have the now familiar Twitter warnings. Pete Wehner, a former speechwriter for George W. Bush, calls Trump's ability to have his supporters believe his every word, despite being devoid of fact, his, quote, most malicious legacy. He writes this, quote, "More than half of Republicans said Trump rightfully won, but the election was stolen from him because of widespread voter fraud that favored Biden. Claims that are hallucinations. This might be Donald Trump's most enduring legacy, a nihilistic political culture, one that is tribalistic, distrustful, and sometimes delusional, swimming in conspiracy theories. The result is that Americans are disoriented and frustrated, fearful, and often enraged at one another. Donald Trump didn't invent misinformation and disinformation, but Trump exploited them more effectively than anyone else has in American history. Exhibited in what has happened in the last hour, 17 states, all with Republican attorneys general, and ones where Trump and Joe Biden have told the Supreme Court that they support that long-shot move by Texas's AG to nullify Biden's victories in 4 battleground states. The complete collapse of the Republican Party is where we start this hour with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. Jen Palmieri is here, former White House Communications Director under President Obama and former Communications Director for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Also joining us, Tim Miller, former Communications Director for Jeb Bush's 2016 campaign, a contributor to The Bulwark, and the Political Director for Republican Voters Against Trump, and Steve Schmidt's back, political strategist, Lincoln Project co-founder, my longtime friend. Steve Schmidt, I got to hear what's on your mind about all this.
Well, this was a monumental month in the history of the country. Democracy is fueled by faith and belief by the people in the legitimacy of the system. And our system requires both sides in the competition of ideas that's decided in elections. It requires both sides to be willing to lose an election. And if you have one side who is no longer willing to lose an election and won't represent the popular will of the American people, then what you have on American soil is an autocratic political party. And so we have some Republican senators, none of whom covered themselves with glory in any of this, with the exception of Mitt Romney over these last couple of years. At least we have 6 of them who hold on to the basic tenets of American democracy behind the lines of the autocratic movement, right? Really a last defense, I suppose, in the Republican Party. And then all of the rest of us on the other side of that line, from AOC and Bernie Sanders to the Lincoln Project and Tim Miller and all of the folks that stood with Joe Biden, whose careers have been as conservatives or Republicans, right? American politics realigned this month. We're now one election away in this country from losing our democracy because one party doesn't believe in it. We saw the poisoning of American democracy drip by drip, drop by drop this month until we saw 82% of Republicans said, hey, this is illegitimate. And once you reach that critical mass, you're in a lot of trouble as a society and a country. And this is going to be the defining political fight, I suspect, over the balance of all of our lifetimes. But truly a historic month, and not one for the good, in the middle of a profound calamity. And Trump's vandalism of this country, its institutions, has been profound, and it will be damaging for a long time to come.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
What I constantly get outside of this show when people talk to me is that they always want to know why. Why is this happening? Why is Mitch McConnell doing this? Why doesn't Mitch McConnell have people in Kentucky who need help? Why is he doing this? And your explanation yesterday stopped me in my tracks, as I said here last night. And it does seem to explain everything that we're talking about in terms of what Washington Republicans were up to today, both with the Supreme Court and with the refusal to move on COVID relief.
Well, you saw it coming this summer, Lawrence, the astounding moment when the Republican platform became nothing more than a loyalty oath to Donald Trump, an oath of obedience, complete obedience to Trump. That's what the Republican platform was. Not even a pretense of policy issues or ideas in it. And so today's a historic day. And I know that sometimes in the instant analysis culture of fast-moving events, we can overstate the importance of an event in the context of the moment and say that this is a meaningful event in history. Sometimes it's obvious. On September 11th, right? For sure, you could say on that day that that was a meaningful event in American history. It was a before and after moment. Today was a before and after moment in the life of the nation. 106 members of Congress broke faith with American democracy today. They did something the fascists, the Nazis, the Confederate Army was unable to do. They forced a majority of elected officials of one of the 2 major parties in a federal House broke faith with the idea that the people are sovereign, that we're a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy definitionally requires one side being willing to lose an election, to accept the results, to come back the next time in the competition of ideas. And so what we saw today, this breaking of faith, which followed the poisoning of faith and belief in the system, the American system, the American Republic, which has endured since 1776. It was poisoned this month, faith and belief in it. And we're going to live with this now for all the balance, certainly of our lives, Lawrence, because the competition in American politics is now between a Democratic Party, meaning a party that believes in democracy, versus an autocratic party. And we've never seen that. When you see that many members of Congress breaking faith with their oath to overturn an election because they don't like the result, we're off the reservation to a place that we might not be able to get back on it from. And so it's a very worrying moment. And what it means is now we're one election away from losing the country to people who no longer believe in democracy.
Talking a little, able to get people in a room and to get business done. President Obama was not able to do that. And the reason may well be the implacability of people sitting on the other side of the table from him. Sometimes you can't get to yes with someone who won't say anything other than no. And I also think when you look at the rise of the Tea Party movement, the real issue that the Obama administration faced, which is an age-old one, is you can't fix crazy. And the fact of the matter is, you had a fair number of crazy people who started getting elected to the Congress on the Tea Party wave, who there was no dealing with.
So you mentioned immigration. Let's talk about the immigration and how big a turning point that was, the 2013-2014 bill. The Gang of Eight bill that couldn't get through to the House and eventually leads to the ousting of Cantor. It seems like a very important point for the GOP. This was something that when the Senate was dealing with it, it was a very popular idea that finally we're going to deal with reform and immigration and finally once and for all. What's your overview of the 2013-2014 immigration reform fight?
Well, both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, have used this issue as a political wedge, have used it as a campaign issue, and that's taken precedence over solving the problem. And so both sides have plenty cause to look at whatever side's in power at any time and say, well, when they were in power, they didn't move on this. They used it as a wedge issue to appeal to their base. Now, for the Republican Party, the party of George W. Bush, that won a national election in 2004 with the majority of the vote, did so with 43% of the Hispanic vote in the country. The Hispanic voter in America has been completely alienated from the Republican Party by a hostile message. People obviously won't vote for you if they believe you don't like them very much. And it's not just that the Republican rhetoric alienates them, it's almost as if it's purposeful, that there's a deliberate strategy to antagonize the fastest growing demographic group in the country. And the Republican Party will pay a very steep price for that over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years as that population continues to grow. How does
an issue, which has always been there and been talked about and is always part of the top 10, I guess, issues when pollsters talk to the public, how does it become this number one issue that, which we'll talk about in a second, probably got Donald Trump elected? Well, again, this is an issue that's an incitement issue. This issue sells on cable news. It sells on talk radio. It reaches the activists of both sides. And the average American, if you went out and we
got 500 people off of the street and said, you're now the Congress, they would solve this problem within 3 hours, because everybody basically agrees on what the solution is. The border should be secure. The people who are here have acted lawfully but for entering should be regularized, and that they should pay a fine. There's a deal to be made, but again, the issue and the power of its incitement, its capacity to incite, denies a solution.
And the difficulty within the GOP to come to grasp with that, what you've just stated, is what?
Reality. We had a presidential election where the presidential winner said, we're going to build a wall paid for by Mexico. It was a fantasy. So we see this blurring of lines between reality and fantasy. It's driven by cable news, it's driven by talk radio, it's driven by social media, driven by the internet. And you see a reciprocal dishonesty from the left, for example, when the Democratic candidates are promising free stuff for everybody, hundreds of trillions of dollars of new spending. It's as equal a fantasy as the Mexican paid-for wall. But the obliteration between reality and fantasy, what's achievable and unachievable, has occurred, and it's occurred some time ago to the great detriment of our politics and our country.
One last question before we go to the Trump years. The midterm elections in 2014, where the GOP takes back the Senate, is a point where Obama basically gives up on bipartisanship. His people around him, and he decide that executive orders is the way to get something done. This is used as a way to attack him as the man who wants to be king. How important a point was that? How does that define, and how ironic